Can you see? They can see us.
You can see us, but we can't see anyone.
You should be able to see them. I don't know. I'll move it again. This meeting is being recorded. Continue to get permission. I think this one we can see. Here you go.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give everyone a few more minutes to arrive, and then we'll get started. Okay, it's 12 o'clock, so I know we will still have some people filtering in, but I think we'll get started so that we have plenty of time for question and answer. My name is Cynthia Miller-Idris. I'm a professor in the School of Public Affairs and in the School of Education here at American University, and for several years worked with the team at IIIT on the Advancing Education in Muslim Societies project, and have been involved in the collaboration between IIIT and AIMS and ITEP from its origins. And so I'm very, very pleased to kind of be reunited with Dr. Ilham Nasser and Dr. Ahmed Awani, who will be speaking to you today about this new wave of data coming out of the Advancing Education in Muslim Societies mapping project. So I'll just briefly introduce them and then turn over the floor. I just want to say it's been a very powerful collaboration and powerful partnership for AU and for ITEP, and I couldn't be happier to be here with you all today. And sorry that we can't be in person. So Dr. Ahmed Awani, who is has many, many different hats, too many hats to summarize, but I think most important in the current context, I want to say he's unique as a businessman, but also has a doctorate in human development and approaches the work of IIIT, and where he's a vice president, as from within a context of understanding all of human, a holistic approach to human development, to understanding the role of education in its broadest definition, from cradle to grave across the life course, and has been really instrumental in helping this research move forward with the support across multiple countries, 14 countries, and predominantly Muslim parts of the world, to try to understand what the developmental values and competencies look like among students and teachers. And as part of his work at IIIT, he brought Dr. Ilham Nasser over from George Mason University to work full-time and run this massive research project. And for several years now has had data coming out of many countries, and I know we'll learn a lot today from what they have to say. Dr. Ilham Nasser also is a sort of expert in peace building, has done work in kindergartens, kindergarten curriculum with peace building, and a long history of human development approach. I know their full bios. I talked yesterday with Dr. Nasser about whether we should present their full bios, and she was encouraging me to just let us get on with it. So I could go on and on for their accolades, and we'll point you, and maybe Dr. Nasser can point you to their website where their full bios sit. For those of you who are interested, I really do encourage you to read them because they're both incredibly impressive individuals with histories of publications and work and engagement socially in the world as well. So with that, I'm just going to say I'm delighted here to represent ITEP as a faculty member, and I will turn it over to Dr. Nasser and Dr. Awani. But I just want to point out to the audience that the Q&A function is enabled. You can put your questions there. I will be moderating Q&A at the end. And there is an upvoting feature. So when someone puts a question into the Q&A chat, in the Q&A box, you can give it a thumbs up. And since we are anticipating a lot of participants here in the audience, that will help me determine what are the questions that are of the greatest interest. So it's a sort of democratic approach through upvoting. I'll try to get to all questions, but if I can't, I will prioritize the ones that have the most interest from the audience. So do try to not only put questions, but read the others and give it a thumbs up if you would like it to be something that I pull into the Q&A after the presentation. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Awani and Dr. Nasser. And I think you're muted still. There you go.
Hi, everyone. I would like to thank you very much, Cynthia. And first of all, I thank American University, the ITIP program, in particular School of Education, for the opportunity to partner with us this time again. They were our partners before, and Cynthia has actually seen this project since the start, since its inception, was a very big part of it from the beginning. And still is. So I appreciate the time and I appreciate the cooperation and the collaboration that we've had and all the support we have had from American Youth School of Education ITIP program. I'd like to welcome all of the participants in this session, and thank you very much for your time and for the opportunity to listen to what we have to say. I will be brief in my introduction. As Cynthia has stated, I serve as the Vice President of IIIT. So I'll give you a little bit of a background on IIIT as an organization and what we do. And that would give you hopefully a context for Mapping the Terrain project that we were discussing here today. So IIIT, the story of IIIT, the way I see it, started, it's the story of its founders, started back in 1981 when a group of Muslim intellectuals migrated to the West for their undergrad and grad studies, and in early stage in their lives. And they were yearning for their Muslim societies to partner with the rest of the world in building a moral and value-based civilization, and make their marks and their contributions to world civilization based on respect for human dignity, for freedom, for democratic ideals, regardless of where people may decide to live. So out of this conviction for the founders, they came together to found what was named afterwards as the International Institute of Islamic Thought. They determined that at the time that the essence of why Muslim societies were not playing an active role and partnering with the rest of humanity in building the intellectual in building the civilization, and playing their part with all their rich heritage to do so. So they attributed this backwardness, if you would, or the what they described as the malaise of Muslim societies, to an intellectual crisis. And that intellectual crisis was defined by them as a perceived contradiction between faith or revelation and reason in Islamic thought. So accordingly, they set up IIIT to provide a platform for Muslim intellectuals to discuss these topics freely and openly, without fear or coercion, in order to first confirm that theory that actually the crisis was an intellectual crisis, and secondly, of course, to offer some insights and research and data of how this situation and this circumstance could change. So the vehicle that they use to accomplish their goals and contributing to the social and intellectual transformation of Muslim society has been through research, through teaching, and mainly many partnerships with universities across the Muslim world, and these partnerships contributed to improving the curricula in Islamic studies in particular and social sciences, and the combination of the two in order to produce what they considered new knowledge that's more contextualized in Muslim societies. So few years ago, the IIIT, in its effort to rebrand after 40 years of existence or so, or close to it, we have adopted advancing education in Muslim societies as an overall mission for the Institute, in addition to reform of Islamic thought, which was the ultimately the core mission of IIIT. So in addition to this, we have adopted the advancing education in Muslim societies as more of an umbrella program or initiative, if you would, for the Institute. So the philosophy of the reform of advancing education in Muslim societies, pretty much based on the integration of knowledge, concept and philosophy and programs, which constituted most of the work of IIIT in the past 40 years or so. So it was built on it. It used it as the core of its reform effort, and it is the pretty much the pillar of the initiative of advancing education in Muslim society. Also, this program meant to address other factors that were not emphasized in IIIT past effort, so namely empirical research and understanding the context of education. So this was not emphasized in the past 40 years or so of the Institute's work, because it mainly focused on the philosophy of education and the goals of education, as opposed to also contributing to leadership and governance, for example, to provide the context, in this case, for reform. In addition, advancing education in Muslim societies also focused on different means of disseminating knowledge. So as opposed to just focusing on publications and teaching programs, we also adopted policy recommendations as part of our dissemination methods, and that should help and assist policymakers, in education and in public policy in some cases, to make better decisions based on the research that IIIT has been conducting. And this was part of AIM's effort. Also, in this regard, we adopted several assessment and evaluation methods, and we institutionalized that as part of our work. So we will have a feedback mechanism to what we do in order to provide us with, data-driven, programs and projects under the umbrella of aims or advancing education in Muslim societies. So this is where really mapping the terrain project that the focus of our discussion today came about. So this all led to to design a project, a research project that is empirical in nature and it's data driven to provide us with what we think was basically required to advance education in Muslim societies based on universal values, which we've adopted as a paradigm for the integration of knowledge concept. So mapping the terrain aims at advocating for a human development approach in education, and it takes a human development as not only a goal for education reform, but also as part of the process of this reform. And I leave it here to Dr. Ilham to give you much more details on mapping the terrain itself, the data collection process, and also this terrain of it, because this is the second time that the second wave of data collection with some changes from the last one, if you're familiar with it. So I leave it with Dr. Ilham Nasser to tell you all the details about what the project is all about and how it was conducted. And thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A to answer any question that you might have.
All right, thank you, Dr. Awani. Thank you, Cynthia, for moderating, and thank you, American University, for co-hosting this event. I also have to thank our team at IIIT who helped put this together, the writing team and others. What I want to also send specific and greetings to our partners in the different countries where we conducted the research. So I hope some of them are in attendance as well. I want to present this study, but give you more of an overview. And if you are interested more in the details, of course, because of the time limit we have here, it's a multi-site, large data set that we can go into so many different directions in the discussion and the presentation. But if you're interested in more information on this, I think David will put the link to the report, the actual report, in the chat for you to take a look. So I would like to continue from here and present the results of the 2019-2020 study. As Dr. Awani mentioned, we wanted to look at the human development, and we started this study in 2018. This is the second round of data that we have, and our focus is reflected in this quote that I hope you all can see. We are interested in not only the academic and the achievement of youth in education systems and in general, but we're also interested in their lives, interested in improving the trajectory of youth, but also the next generations of leaders. We are focusing this study on cognitive, social, and emotional skills and values. And I would like to point out here that you're going to hear me using competencies, skills, and values somewhat interchangeably, but I do realize, and I hope you all realize, the difference between values and competencies. But some of our constructs can be under values, some can be under competencies. When we designed this study, we were looking at different models, and some models in the theoretical areas caught our attention, one of which is the spiral dynamics model. It has been articulated based on several people and several theorists that you see them listed here. What we like about the model is the spiral nature of development, as we are concerned with the human development trajectory across the lifespan, like Cynthia indicated earlier. We adapted this after, of course, intensive review, and extensive look at the literature. We adapted it to an approach that we call it the spiral progression, because we do realize that in many contexts, the life can go, never goes actually in some symmetrical linear direction, but life has twists and turns. And look at us today during this pandemic that has been more than 11 months right now. We're adapting as we go. We go back and forth with our lives, and we also have sometimes adversaries. Sometimes we have to deal with different life conditions, and that's what attracted, my attention to this specific model. But we really base our study on a collection of works in the human development field. We looked at Kohlberg, of course, all the traditionalists. We looked at Maslow, and we looked at others. And in order to articulate to you what brings all of these constructs together, I like to present it in this approach, or in this chart. You can look at this chart as multidimensional, even at 3D. It doesn't mean here that these values, competencies increase as we go or improve, and one is better than the other. But it's a way for us to organize the different constructs that we measure. You might look at this and say, wow, there's so many variables here, skills, competencies, whatever we want to call it, and call these, but they are all interrelated. And that what you see are the representations of the measures we use to look at the area of open-mindedness, the area of responsibility, the area of collaborative, collective. And if you look at these are umbrella concepts and umbrella components that house within them empathy, meaning making, and their open-mindedness. All of the definitions will be in the report, and we talk about how do we really look at meaning making, for example. It's an interesting construct from an Islamic perspective, but also from a cognitive, emotional perspective, that people are trying to have a sense of purpose, for example, and make meaning of their lives, their accomplishments, their challenges, and so forth. Under the umbrella of open-mindedness, which could be considered a group of competencies, we see empathy, we see problem solving. So we see a mixture of cognitive as well as emotional, socio-emotional competencies here. Same for responsibility. You see that we listed self-regulation, emotional regulation, self-efficacy, gratitude. Now, self-regulation, emotional regulation is known to be, in the field of human development, is known to be a developmental skill that we develop early in life as we are growing as human beings. But we also found that self-regulation, emotional regulation are skills that could be taught, but they also could be taught to adults. And I'm sure many of you in the audience can relate to this, where you see people who get upset too quickly and cannot control their emotions, whether they're happy or sad. So these are all life skills, and some people call them soft skills. We like to call them, socio-emotional, psychosocial, and it doesn't really matter in terms of the terminology, but these are of interest to us. And we view them within this spiral approach that I just mentioned, where we move from the egocentric, being very focused on myself and my group, moving up to the worldly and to the tawheed. The uniqueness of this approach is that in two aspects. One is that we added the collective as an important entry point for transformation, but it's also an important group of competencies that are very relevant to the population we worked with and the participants we surveyed. And we also add the faith aspect of Tawheed into this trajectory. And people can go back and forth in terms of their understanding, in terms of the reflection of these in their lives, based on where they are and their conditions. Beck and others talk about life conditions impacting people, and always the pandemic is a very good example, extreme example of how life conditions change all of us and make us adapt in ways that we have never thought we would. So I want to briefly also talk about the methodology and tell you the story of our participants. Our participants were from 15 different countries. We keep going back and forth, 14, 15, but because not all of them are countries, we included the Tatarstan, for example, that is a region in Russia. So we have 15 different locations in this study. We focused this wave or this new study 2019-2020 on school teachers, school students, university and university instructors, and university students. Our largest group is the school students because we were able to access good numbers of students in many locations. We took existing scales because they have established reliabilities, and reliability here means that the items on a scale are consistent. They're consistent over, over measurement in different places, different contexts. So these were existing scales, but we made adaptations to these scales to make sure that they are applicable, but also sensitive to the culture and social context that we survey. Of course, we also conducted our own reliabilities to make sure that the way we adapted our measures are still reliable, the items consistently are revealing the same scores or the same numbers. This is a map that shows you where we were in this study. And this is the first time we add the US for those interested in the US sample, but we'll also added more of the Arab countries. We have Algeria, Morocco, Jordan this round, which we did not have last year. But we have, diverse communities, and we work with different partners, different researchers, and all of them went through training on the ethical use of human subjects and conduction of research, as well as we went through the IRB of Indiana University, and this is a good point to thank Indiana University and the team there for their help with the IRB. Just to tell you a little bit of the demographics of who these people were, our participants. We had mostly, like I said, school students, 60% of the sample. Most of our data came from India, followed by Bosnia. And if you see, the US was the smallest sample, just because we were not able to get to the university level Muslim students, we targeted school students, secondary education students in the US. And so they were, we included some of the Islamic schools in the US, mostly on the East Coast, if I'm not mistaken. So you see that sampling in a way was not randomized totally in all the places, but because we had access to Muslim schools, private and public, we tended to go where we had permissions from governments and officials, but also where we had access to principals and to universities as well. Slightly more females than males in this sample. Last year we had like almost half and half, but here we have 58% were females. And if you look at the distribution by age, the largest sample was from the school students less than 18. So we have lots of implications here and lessons to be learned, not only about the adults, but also about the youth. And maybe build on some of the qualities that we found as we look at the implementation and implications of such a study. If you look at the adults education here, the school teachers, the university faculty, that was a highly educated sample as expected. Most of them had a bachelor degree or even higher. In terms of religion, of course, it's expected to have a majority of Muslims in the sample. We do have few countries with a mixture of Muslim and non-Muslim, mostly Christians. And let's look at Kenya, for example, Mauritius. And in those places where we could access mixed schools, we wanted to also have non-Muslims as part of our sample as much as we could. But our main focus really is on Muslim youth, Muslim teachers, or youth and teachers and university students in Muslim contexts. Now I will go through some of the findings, and as I said earlier, I'm going to give an overview, so I won't take all the time presenting, but what I would like to share are a few slides showing the means, followed by what we call the structural equation models. And these models tell us a little bit about how these constructs, these variables, values, competencies interact together in a way that is impactful in the aftermath of this study. Like, how can we really use the data to have some implications for educational context, universities, higher ed, and so forth. If you look at the first table here is the table of reliabilities. We are usually looking at 0.7 and above for good, very good reliability, and we have some that are 0.8, 0.9, but we also have 0.6, meaning that we were approaching, we have good reliability overall, but some scales, showed more and higher consistency, which what reliability is all about. And then the next slide shows you some of the means we had. And I want to mention here that our scales, unlike the originals, the Likert scale was from 1 to 4, where 1 is strongly disagree, not important at all, to 4, which is strongly agree and very important. And if you look at the means, we actually have high means on most of these constructs, these measures, except for forgiveness and self-efficacy for students that are at the 2 point something, lower than the rest of the variables. We will look further to see what that means because we have more results to share regarding these two, but that's something to keep in mind. On all others, including collectivistic orientation, for example, we have higher where it's 3 and above. So remember, the highest is 4 in this case. Here we look at the, I think this is where people get, excited about seeing all the countries together. I'm excited about this because, there is always the claim that there is social desirability in these kinds of surveys. But what happened here is that we are seeing the variations, and actually the variations on the constructs we measured last year, we can see it here. So they're similar to last year's variations between the different locations. Empathy, forgiveness were ones from 2018, 2019, and we see here consistently that there are across country variations. And interestingly enough, you could see that, forgiveness, as you see here in the middle, shows that lower means I talked about. But then at the same time, we see religiosity, spirituality, those items looked at how people perceive their own faith. And that also there is more variation there, but most countries were consistently with high means on that. If you look at the rest of the variables here, it gives some indication where life satisfaction, for example, in places like Kyrgyzstan, much higher than other places. And I think that I don't want for people to think that, oh, we're comparing, because that requires really more in-depth comparisons, not just looking at across country, but that gives you an overview of where participants were in terms of the different locations. We do have in the report more of these slides showing the participants by category. So how did the students score versus their teachers? How did the university students score versus their faculty? So, but I wanted to share this with you to look at the differences and the variations within the countries. So this means that our measures performed well because we do see some variation in the means and the scores of each of the countries that were part of the study. As I mentioned, the second part I wanted to talk about in this presentation and to give this overview is really how do these variables interact together. And we can look at this and say, okay, some of these are predictors, usually the ones on the outside, empathy, meaning making are predictors here. In the middle, you would see the mediators, which means that these variables or this one particular variable is mediating the impact of empathy in predicting gratitude as the outcome. And of course, we did not start here. We started with some hypothesized models that we put together based on the literature, based on our study results, and based on looking at what makes sense logically, but also what tells the story of the general population, the story of the instructors, and the story of the students. So in the general story, we see here that empathy had direct, meaning that it directly predicting gratitude, but also had a predicted gratitude through the collectivistic orientation. So the mediator here, which is collectivism, actually mediated both predictors, empathy and meaning making. If you look at the numbers, you see that empathy had a larger, bigger number in predicting gratitude, while meaning making was still significant, but it wasn't as strong. It was weaker. This is to look at the general, and empathy was one of our predictors last year, and actually it impacted largely the outcome variables. And in the hypothesized model, we had forgiveness and gratitude, but we found out in this study that forgiveness was not really predicted here by empathy or meaning making through the mediating effect of collectivism. And then when we look at the teacher's model here, again, looking at the pathways of prediction and mediation, you could see that emotion regulation, self-regulation, all of these pathways here in this model were actually significant. And if you see meaning making, this whole idea of finding purpose in life was actually a predictor of teacher self-efficacy, but more teacher life satisfaction. Why do we put these variables here? As I said, we want to tell the story and bring the issues and the strength that teachers, instructors may have in terms of how they responded to these measures of meaning making, of gratitude. So it's very clear that meaning making, gratitude impact life satisfaction greatly of teachers through the mediating effect of self-regulation and emotion regulation. Again, I mentioned those two as mediating effects because of their importance, not only for children, but also for adults. And instructors here includes teachers as well as higher education, university instructors. Now we go into the students' model. And the students' model, we wanted to see, last year we had empathy as a predictor and wanted to see what happens when we move empathy to become an outcome. What can predict empathy in students? And these are the largest group in our study, the ones who are around 18 years old, mostly in secondary education. And we see here that sense of belonging, another construct that we measured in both studies, we see that sense of belonging actually also is significantly impacting empathy more through emotion regulation than self-efficacy. And you see that emotion regulation here also plays a role mediating between problem solving and empathy. So this mixture of sense of belonging, important for people to feel like they're part of something bigger, problem solving, which is the ability to think, not just critically, but also solve problems, find the ways to solve problems, and the emotion regulation, the ability to control yourself, control your emotions, are very important to developing empathy in students. Of course, anyone can take the data set that we will share and it's already shared on our website, and look into other variations and other constructs and how they interact. We are happy with these final models, even though they did not really confirm all of what we hypothesized. But a good look at the section on the interactions between the constructs might give some clues on what else could we model here that someone may be interested in. This is just to give you, the flavor of what the data is telling us regarding the interactions between all of the different constructs. Now, of course, the so what question always comes to mind. So I'm going to try to conclude, some main conclusions, but also look at the educational intervention, the human development aspects of this whole process of growth and the trajectory for growth that I presented earlier. We did not find differences on demographic variables, age, gender. They didn't really make a difference in the way people responded to our survey. We also saw, and you saw that in the tables on means, we saw that most groups rated these values competencies again highly, except for forgiveness and self-efficacy for students. The rest were really high, like religion, self-regulation, the collective orientation, and empathy are just examples. The results also confirm that general structural equation models we hypothesized for most of the variables, but it didn't do us well with forgiveness as an outcome variable. I think that that requires further research, but also if you noticed in the models, there were few negative numbers there, and these are interesting for us, and we think we should investigate further because they don't confirm our hypothesis, but also don't confirm what we know from the literature on the connection and the prediction power of some of the variables, like self-efficacy, for example. We know that it has a positive impact on gratitude, on many other constructs. It didn't play that role in at least in this analysis, and I think that it will be very interesting and very important to pursue further these structural equation models to look at what the data is telling us about these. I think that in terms of implications, and very briefly, I want to allow enough time for the Q&A, but the implications of such a study are multiple actually, and it can be taken into all the directions. Dr. Awani mentioned earlier that the overarching goal of AIMS is to actually contribute to policy recommendations, curriculum, and pedagogy, and also, to improving lives. That's why we are adopting this human development approach for people to live in peace and prosperity and to be considerate of each other. And, we think that educational interventions can actually help with taking this data, taking the results and saying, okay, we need to be more intentional about not only making sure our students are computer savvy, our students can do well on international testing like the PISA and others, but that our students are also able to develop certain skills and that are important for academics, but also important for life. Gratitude is an important one, to be satisfied with what you have, to be able to be thankful for people around you, but also things like problem solving, meaning making. These are things that could be taught, and I, as an educator, have experimented with intentionally teaching some of these in the K-12 curriculum and also at the university level. And then we want to also think about the instructors in this case. We know that the situation, the work conditions of instructors and teachers more specifically are not the best in most of the countries whether it's the global south or the north, and that maybe improving teachers' professional development, investing more in teacher preparation, and improving work conditions would be good for teachers. I think that this is a story that probably everyone in education knows, but we have data here to back up what we're saying regarding our unique population, the locations we have participants surveyed. The last thing is regarding the spiral approach, this twists and turns in the progression in life. And I think that if you go back to that, and I do talk about it in lots of details in the report, but if you go back to that, you would see like open-mindedness is a required group of competencies for people to move up and to go into this. And we have lots of evidence in the research about this open-mindedness as an important virtue, as an important group of skills. And then you look at responsibility, and there's a lot of literature on in social development and social sciences on this whole idea of social responsibility. But we want to look at it also as responsibility, but then the highest, I think the most difficult, is getting to this collaborative collective. We have collective societies. We know that collective societies can be collective, but at the same time egocentric, ethnocentric, because they're more taking care of their immediate family, which is very legitimate. I'm not minimizing that, but I'm saying that these three umbrella concepts can be helpful for us to understand how can we expand this collectivistic approach to others, to include others. And again, I hate to be drawing examples from the pandemic, but I think we will be learning a lot about the pandemic and its impact on the human relations and our social, emotional development. But that I think we should be more intentional about creating this collaborative collective. It's not something we found lots of studies on, actually not many, few, and we are further exploring what does it mean to be a collaborative collective. So some of the skills and competencies we listed are important to explore further, like this orientation and does being on social media, does that promote more individualistic or more collectivistic approach? We saw here that it didn't. We also looked at forgiveness, and maybe we need to be intentional about forgiveness education. This is something I'm personally passionate about. So we have a lot to figure out regarding this whole framework or the approach that I presented. And I think other sets of values can go under each one of those areas, because I think we didn't really capture, of course, we didn't capture all, but we captured as many as we were interested in and as suggested by the literature. I want to end this by talking about the limitations. I'm sure people are thinking, okay, so you have this quantitative study, lots of things could go wrong, but I consider ourselves to be lucky because we completed the data collection in all the countries right before the lockdowns in most of the places around the globe and most of the countries. The only two places that collected rest of the data in June were Malaysia and a little bit in the US, but most of the countries completed data collection early in March. We consider ourselves lucky to have done that. And then, of course, this is a survey. It captures attitudes at that data collection period. We cannot tell more right now about the pre-pandemic, post-pandemic. There's lots of research going on that, but we did capture the attitudes, the perceptions of these right before the lockdowns. And of course, always follow-up studies are recommended. More qualitative studies are recommended, and qualitative studies will also help us understand how people perceive these across different cultures. So for example, problem solving. In the US, we have curricula, we have materials on problem solving, but it may have a different meaning somewhere else. I think we started looking at the values, the constructs, and how people perceive it in different places. But I think further qualitative studies would definitely improve not only how we see these constructs, but also how we translate them. Despite all the rigor in the translation process, we had few where we had the surveys were not as reliable, and I think it's because of the translation. Data collection was done using the Scantron, like people had an answer sheet, and this proved to be challenging in some of the locations, especially with youth at schools. So what we did is we surveyed most of our partners, and many of them said that online surveying would definitely be a better way to go once we decide, and if we decide to collect data again. I think that these are just few of the limitations. I'm sure there are more, but I hope this data and this study provides some insights on further research, on explaining, analyzing what meaning we can get out of this data set, and would help people who are in their doctoral studies and beyond to use some of the data. We have had people use the data from last year, but I would like to encourage people to take a look at our report, take a look at our website, and also register to have access to all the other reports. Thank you so much, and I appreciate all the audience as well as the panelists. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ilham, for a really fascinating presentation. Just before we move into Q&A, I just want to confirm, is there anything else that either, are you ready to move into Q&A basically between the two of you? Anything else to add? Okay. All right, great. There are a number of questions here. In fact, I'm going to ask you to continue sharing your screen for a minute and just maybe go back to the structural equation model. So maybe I can start with a couple of questions about that. And then after that, I think they're probably questions that we can just go to the full video so that people might be able to see you. So several people have some questions about the relationships here and whether I mean, so right now the structural equation model here is general, but do you have data yet, or have you had the analysis yet on whether there are variations depending on the demographics of the group? Both one question here is really interesting about several folks are interested in about the variation between whether the participants were Muslims in a majority non-Muslim country or city, or whether they were in a country that was predominantly or overwhelmingly Muslim in terms of its population. Did that make a difference? Were there differences between the countries? Were there differences between boys and girls, or different ages of the participants? So lots of different questions about variation in the relationships there, and maybe we can start with that.
Sure. I mean, those in the audience who are methodologists can tell and testify to how time-consuming generating these structural equation models. But what we wanted to do is to just give a teaser of what can people do with the data, and just explore very generally, in general, how do these variables interact. I think all of what you mentioned could be and can be and should be, as separate studies. What we did ourselves here at IIIT in the previous study, we took certain variables and we just looked at them across male and females. We took variables and looked at prediction power of certain variables, for example, for adults. And then we did one for youth, and we played in several publications with the different models. I would like to invite people who asked about that to do it themselves. And of course, we will be exploring these even further and trying to learn more, at least about the one on instructors and the one on students, because I think they give us the most information about the youth versus the adults. But definitely, I think further research and further analysis will be required to learn more about what these nuances and these very interesting research questions.
And then there were just a couple of clarifications, which I'll communicate, and that might help before we drop the figures here. So one was a question about, it looks like meaning making had a negative relationship to life satisfaction. Is that correct? Negative 0.08. I don't see it on this model, so maybe was on another model. Is it possible that meaning making was negative, and how would you explain that basically?
So this is the teachers, the meaning making in teachers, or yeah, in teachers, the 0.08, right? We had several negatives that we don't know. I mean, we didn't hypothesize that there will be negative relationships there. We hypothesized all positive. And actually, based on the literature, we know, like, for example, that meaning making should have a positive impact on life satisfaction. For some reason, there are negatives. We looked at this with our methodologists, and I think we need to look further to explain that. But here, what I can say, what the data is telling us is that meaning making did not really predict higher life satisfaction. It just went the other way around. And definitely, there are others that were negative, few others, not many. And they can say several things, whether it's on the data set, whether it's the variables and how we group them together, or just that in our sample, this is what we found out. Oh, you're muted, Cynthia.
Sorry, Zoom fail there for just a second. So there are some questions about, here's one about the variable. Was there a variable of religiosity in the model from someone who knows that it was included in the survey? And so could you talk a little bit about whether that, did it have any predictive power, and it doesn't show up in the model here?
Yeah. Intentionally, we didn't put religiosity as a predictor or an outcome. We spent the time on religiosity in the first study, but I think the audience should also know that religiosity was a problematic variable for us. So I wanted to consider it in this study more on the demographic side rather than the value or the competency. And we had problems with it because some of the countries we could not ask the questions we wanted to ask. Some countries deleted the religiosity items. Some countries mixed them up and had them in the middle of the survey rather than the beginning. So we had a lot of translation issues with the religiosity, and I think it requires its own study. And we did write a paper based on the first set on religiosity in particular and its prediction or even mediation of empathy and forgiveness. And it was, unlike empathy, it wasn't as strong as you would think, right? For this study here that I'm presenting today, I think that, adding religiosity would have added a lot of mixed results for us, and it wouldn't have been very clean to include it right now, but it does require its own study for sure. And we have the data on religiosity. People can take the sample and look at the prediction power of religiosity like we did last year, or even look at the differences between Muslims and non-Muslims and do a whole study on that. So yes, the short answer, we intentionally left it out.
Got it. Okay, thank you. There's also a question here about the comparisons between the data you collected in 2018, 2019, and the data you collected in 2019, 2020 on some of the features which were the same, with the acknowledgement that there were some different ones, and in some of the countries that were the same. Have you had a chance yet to look at that? And do you think that there were results that followed previous patterns, or were there surprises?
Yeah, I think that what I mentioned throughout my presentation regarding the variables we tested twice, like empathy and forgiveness, sense of belonging, that the results were similar in terms of the means. The prediction power of empathy was not the same like last year, but maybe because we also changed the other variables on the different pathways. I think that, again, maybe taking these variables from the data from last year with this year might be a nice study for people who are interested. But also what we did with these variables is that we changed them a little. We dropped items in the factor analysis that were not good items. So this might vary between last year and this year. So you have to be careful about comparing We added the new ones because these are related variables to what we did last year, and we dropped two from last year that did not prove to be reliable, and that's why we had some variation. But I think that consistent ones, it's a very nice study to do, to look at the two sets of data and compare.
Great. Thank you very much. There's a question here, which is also a question I had, which is about the dissemination of the results back within the countries. Are there plans, or do you have advice here on how these results could get their way back to teachers or to ministries of education or local communities in ways that might be useful to them? And what are your thoughts on that in terms of the dissemination here beyond sort of the academic research communities?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Dr. Awani, you want to address that within like aims or the dissemination, yeah, like the implications I just talked about. Because that, you know, the answer to this question, I'm looking at Dr. Awani because it of course requires, this is a self-funded study. I think people need to know. So IIIT, our vice president here, invested in this study. I think we cannot really continue to be supporting it within country, but I think that people should just take the lessons learned and look at the within country data sets and make their own recommendations. We may go in some smaller studies later on, right? We don't know.
Dissemination of data, you mean, Cynthia, or dissemination of you know, in a sense that...
Yeah, I think more the question here is about the findings in terms of, so I think the data will be public, but let's say for non-experts, non-methodologists, what would you recommend for people within their countries if they want to get these findings out to teachers or to share with local ministries of education? I think the question was, were there other plans in existence to do that? And if not, can they kind of make those, can they take the data and make the recommendations themselves? Or what would you kind of ideally see happen in terms of impact back on local educational communities? If I've understood those questions correctly, I think that's what they're getting at.
We're open to, if the, you know, in any country that there is a possibility that we organize, particularly right now with the pandemic, I guess, and the travel restriction, most probably is going to be like a, you know, a Zoom meeting or something. So if there is such an arrangement, we do not have, as far as I know right now, we do not have a program beyond having the data available to the public, you know, on our website and a couple of other platforms to, you know, actually discuss what the implication might be, or further research or whatever. But if there's an opportunity for someone to arrange for us to present the findings to whether, you know, Department of Educations or teachers or schools in particular or whatever, we would be happy to accommodate.
Maybe I'll give an example from Malaysia, for example. Our research team in Malaysia took the Malaysian data and analyzed it and actually made their own recommendation as they apply to Malaysian context, and invited people from the ministry, from universities, teachers and others, and actually presented you know, the big research to them. And then they had their own session where they talked about how does this data apply and can have implications for Malaysia. Another thing we're doing is we just set up an Arabic country specific sharing of data, and our partners will be on that panel. They will talk about maybe some of the nuances of conducting research and surveying, and some of the successes and challenges they have. We have 4 different Arab countries that will be represented on the panel. It will be in Arabic, and ministry personnel and academician, educators, teachers we actually surveyed are going to be invited. But like Dr. Awani mentioned, we are open to these opportunities, but we really don't have the person power to go to each country and talk unless people, approaches. I want to also say that in the US, for example, we're already in the process of having a very small follow-up study to what we're doing, and they're doing focus groups and asking teachers. So this way we can strengthen the implication piece for the US-based schools as well. But this is all, the US team is doing that, not necessarily us here. I hope that.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that answers it. Thank you both. There is a question here for Dr. Ilham about sort of reflecting on 2 years of this process. What do you know now that you wish you would have known prior to this research?
I mean, as a researcher, one of the challenges we had was really having, it's very common for some reason that some of the items are phrased negatively. And I learned from last year and this year that reversing these into different languages can be misunderstood. And in the analysis, you have to drop these reversed items because they just didn't mean anything and people had a hard time understanding. This is like on the researcher level. On the surveying level, of course, there are lots of lessons I learned, but I was very, I was a strong believer in the paper and pencil methods. For those who are researchers, I think that moving to online can also improve accuracy and the quality of the data. We have high quality data because we had very, very rigid measures. We trained and invested in training our research teams and coordinators. But I think if I knew more of that 2 years ago, I would have taken those two into consideration. On the personal level, of course, I'm learning as we go. I'm learning about how we develop models, how, and so forth. And it's not just me. Again, there is a team who has been helping with here at IIIT, who has been helping with all of this. And so I'm thankful for all the learning, I guess.
Terrific. Thank you, Ilham. There's a question here about empathy, and just from a person asking if she has correctly understood that empathy was a strong predictor of some of the other constructs, or what were the strongest predictors of some of the constructs. So could you talk a little bit more about the importance of empathy or any other really interesting correlations that surprised you in these models? What was it that stands out to you the most?
Yeah, I mean, empathy, we tried it in different places and it had strong prediction power, but also had, as an outcome, was also significant in terms of the mediation powers of other variables impacting empathy. But as we know from the literature on empathy, and we focus a lot on the perspective taking, there's several domains of empathy that people have been researching, but this whole idea of caring, of being a caring person to others and your community, not just the person, but the individual, but also the collective. We learned a lot about that. And if you look at the literature again, you will see that it's one of those foundational skill sets, and you can argue it could be taught or not. I am a strong believer in modeling and teaching these kinds of skills. How do you put yourself into someone else's shoes when you are younger? Most people will not be able to do that on their own as 6, 7, or 8 years old. I think as we grow and we intentionally include empathy in our teaching, even in the in the higher ed environment, there's this whole idea of empathy to the collective, empathy that is collaborative, and empathy where I can put myself into someone else's shoes are foundational to many others. What surprised me and maybe a little bit disappointed me, because I've done a lot of research and I published on the issue of forgiveness and forgiveness education, I was kind of thrown off by the fact that all of these variables here in the first model did not really impact forgiveness in this sample. Empathy was a predictor of forgiveness in the previous sample. Maybe it's because of adding this collectivistic orientation as a mediator. And also the lower means on forgiveness. That was another surprising and not surprising, because the measure of forgiveness we use, I actually adopted that adapted that measure from a previous one. It presents people with some kind of a dilemma, of a decision they have to make regarding certain situation, very culturally specific to Muslim societies. And I think people might have had a harder time with the forgiveness questions, figuring out, do I really agree or don't agree? If someone, dated, for example, one of the questions, if someone dated your sister, and, dated your sister is also not something you would just ask. But if someone who was going to be the fiance of your sister left her, that's a hard one for many of these contexts. And I know from my research in the Arab context that this was one of the no questions to ask. But we asked it because we wanted to see what people think, especially youth. And I think the items might have been more difficult than others, but I can't tell. It will, of course, require further research. So that was a disappointment / a surprise.
Thank you, Ilham. There's a question here that might be getting beyond the actual study itself, but leaning on your expertise in curriculum development prior to this project, in kindergartens in particular. I know you had done a lot of work in this area. So the question is, are there ways to instill these kinds of skills or attitudes in the education of youth and adults? What are the, basically how might this translate to, and what are your reflections on how it might translate to actual classroom practice, or the kinds of things that teachers and schools might be doing differently to foster sense of belonging or empathy, or any of these more holistic approaches to human development?
I think that this can have a two-part answer. I can answer the K-12, and I think Dr. Alwani can answer the higher ed one, on how these values can be incorporated into the curriculum. I can take the K-12 first. So in the K-12, we actually had a very small pilot study here we did at IIIT, and we worked with teachers in Islamic schools in the region on the infusion of forgiveness, empathy across the curriculum. And many of those teachers were actually teachers who taught religion and taught sayings, a hadith of the Prophet. They also taught verses from the Quran, and there are tons of those on forgiveness, on empathy. But the teachers were just teaching those as, memorize this. And what we did with them for a whole year, we worked with them on going beyond that, using the problem-solving skills, modeling, and the a framework of socio-emotional education to actually bring those to light, emphasize those in their teaching, utilizing the same exact stories that come from the students' traditions and faith, and using them to support students in their understanding that is more in depth. Of course, you have to start with the teachers. The teachers themselves have to understand that, okay, I'm willing to forgive or be empathetic, but when this is something that is far away from me. But what happens when it's me, my family, my relatives, my closest friends? Do I have a different way of forgiving? And that's, I'm not saying this is easy to do, but maybe what we can do is use our religion as a source for teaching those in more in depth, and more with some analytical skills, and getting to the conclusion that it's actually better for my well-being as an adult and as a student to be able to forgive and let go, to be able to put myself into someone else's shoes, and so forth. So I think that definitely infusing those, a lot of people call them socio-emotional skills. These are life skills, and they're not soft skills. I don't like the terminology soft skills. I think these are values that are important, that we need to live up to. They could be instilled from the youngest. I've done curriculum for kindergarten, infused these also higher ed and secondary education. And I think Dr. Awani can talk about university.
Yeah, I believe Hiba Ismail, our Director of Instructional Design at Fairfax University, part of the audience, she would be probably better off speaking on this topic than me, because she has done that along with the team and our faculty and our academic team at Fairfax University. But in general, what we did is actually we took the process of human development transformations, or the life conditions that were identified by the spiral dynamics models, such as system thinking, open-mindedness, and others. And we took that as part of the concepts, and the values on the other side. We picked up the higher values, 5 values, and not specifically the values in the model. And we, from that process, we develop learning outcomes. And based on those, once you get into learning outcomes, obviously, those of you who are familiar with the instructional design process, you can build a whole curriculum on that. And we built syllabi basically for the, we transformed the general education piece of the curriculum, of the undergrad curriculum. And that's, in our case, was 60 credit hours, 20 courses that we are still actually in the process of developing and completing. And based on these outcomes, we developed syllabi and reading materials and all of that. So it's we actually put this in practice, and we're hoping that we implement assessment and evaluation process that we built into the curriculum, so we would be able to have feedback on whether this is something that that's working or not. So we are implementing, you know, some of the findings, at least, of our research in curriculum development, and hopefully we'll have better results once you know, we have the opportunity to implement the curriculum and graduate our first batch of students.
Terrific. Thank you both. We have, just keeping an eye on time, a little bit more time for questions. So if you have any burning last questions, make sure you get them in the Q&A. We probably have room for 2 more rounds. So there's a question here just asking you to expand a little bit on what you mean by self-efficacy. And since I was a part of these early discussions, I know this is a fascinating response. You know, thinking about, in fact, how did you make the decisions about what to include? How do we define things like self-efficacy and sense of belonging? I think would be really interesting to reflect on. I know there were long decisions about what to include and how to think about them, and empathy versus forgiveness versus, you know, how we narrowed those down in those early discussions. And so what does self-efficacy mean? Self-efficacy for what, basically?
And you can speak on the sense of belonging, I guess, Cynthia, right?
Yeah, I have to say I pushed very hard for sense of belonging, and I was, you know, very, very happy to follow the data on that here on the screen. So obviously a lot of my work focuses on that. So I was really keen to see that included. So thank you.
Yeah, I said you can answer this question yourself. But in this study, the way we used it, we had 2 different measures of self-efficacy, one for student, one for teachers. So how do students evaluate themselves as learners, as part of the school community in their academics? While for the teachers, it was more on the professional level. How do teachers evaluate themselves and their efficacy as teachers, as instructors? These items were widely used, the 2 measures, and Mariam, who's on the call, probably can talk more about self-efficacy. We went back and forth with this construct to add it or not several times, but we felt that since we are doing our research mostly in schools right now, that this concept of how do you really evaluate your abilities, your competencies, your state of mind is an important factor, an important concept that needs to be included. Just to also balance between the cognitive versus the socio-emotional emotional values and competencies we included. So every single item, every single measure went through very, very thorough elaborations, discussions, and decisions. And Cynthia, you were part of that at the beginning, but then we also continued with that. We wanted to add some of the values that are important in Islamic context, like gratitude, meaning making. You don't see, maybe you see more right now on these kinds of concepts. We wanted to include those. Hope, for example, we have items on hope. I didn't talk about it much, but the perceived hope scale is actually implemented in many, many other countries, about 20 countries. And we wanted to get our own data from our own population on hope. And hopefully we will use hope to bridge other studies that are conducted on these. So we want to be part of the conversation. We want to bring our voices to the table, and we chose the constructs that not only make sense in terms of the human development trajectory, the entry points, the life conditions, but also what we as aims, as the advancing education society, would be interested in to promote this agenda of reform in these societies. And others, I think what we found out can actually be applicable to other societies as well.
Excellent, thank you. I'm scanning in the chat because there's some questions not in the Q&A box, but in the chat. So just going through that to find a few of them here. And one is asking about what the, do you have any immediate publication plans, or will you present at conferences? I mean, are there dissemination plans within the academic community that people can keep an eye on, or should they be looking to your website for final published reports? Where can they get more information, basically?
Yeah, I mean, as Dr. Awani said, if anyone of the audience has an audience and they would like us to speak, we are happy to do that. If not myself, my other colleague who can speak about this study. We also have two, not necessarily publication, presentations based on this data. This data we just posted this morning. So we just finished everything. So it's fresh data set. We will definitely line up some publications of our own, but we also have two presentations coming up that are already approved, confirmed, and accepted to the American Education Research Association, AERA, in April. And we have one already also accepted at the CIES, Cynthia, Comparative Education International.
Comparative International Education Society, CIES.
Thank you. So that's also accepted, and we will be presenting at both events, inshallah, in April.
Terrific. Well, I think on that note, there are a few remaining questions which are sort of back to the kinds of questions asking about variations that I know you haven't done yet in the analysis, and that you're encouraging people to use the data and do themselves. So I'm going to just leave those there, but I know that that Ilham and Dr. Awani and Dr. Nasser will look at these later, and as a pointer towards some areas that might be of interest in terms of variations in academic background or countries or different demographics. And so with that, since we've just concluded with the next steps and where you're sort of forward thinking, I think we will bring this to a close. I believe there is one final slide, if you could advance it forward, Ilham, that has something about the next Global Education Forum. I hope it's at the end of that. There it is, right, the remainder of the spring schedule. So this is part of a series, the next one on Tuesday, March 16th on new developments in non-formal education, and the Panama Bilingue program in Panama Teach with another collaboration that the School of Education has. So please do register for the remaining Global Education Forum events. And I just want to give a big round of applause virtually, both to Dr. Awani and Dr. Nasser for such phenomenal work. It's such a pleasure to see it come to fruition. And I know from the early discussions, just at a very formative stage, how much work went into this, and travel overseas, and trainings of teams, and data collection, and the input alone of those returned surveys for months by the tireless efforts of research assistants. So tremendously grateful to you for what you've accomplished here and the knowledge that you've contributed back in ways that I know are going to make a difference in educational and communities around the world. So for me, it was a real honor to be a part of those discussions early on. I learned a lot, and it feels very rewarding to see it come to fruition here. So a personal note there. Thank you very much. And thank you to the audience for attending, for joining us, and hope to see you at a future Global Education Forum event.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, AU. Thanks, everyone.
Stay safe, everyone.